Hello everybody and welcome to today's video on AQA English Literature Paper 1 Section B. There are 30 marks available for Section B, the 19th century novel section, and you should spend around 50 minutes on this question. The assessment objectives are AO1, 2 and 3, and I went through those in detail in the first video in this series, but I'll recap them here for those who haven't watched that, and I'll give specific examples related to the 19th century novel. So AO1 is all about response to task and text using supporting references. Now it goes without saying that you need to know your texts inside out. Yes, you'll be provided with an extract from your 19th century novel in the exam, but the question will ask you to explore how something is presented across the text, including the extract. So obviously you'll need to know the text really well to answer the question. The most important thing about this exam, and in fact both literature exams, is the idea of response to task, i.e. answering the question. That underpins everything else. Your number one priority in the literature exams is to answer the questions. And that might sound obvious, but time and time again in past exams what we've seen is a number of students who know something very clever about a text and want to force that into their answer no matter what the question is. Don't let that be you. Priority number one needs to be to answer the question. The 2023 exam report pointed out, and this is a paraphrase, that you should carefully examine the question. It guides you towards a specific theme or idea within the text, and grasping this is crucial. Now, the highest mark band refers to answers which have a conceptualized response and a well-structured line of argument which is explored throughout the answer. Rather than an answer made up of disjointed paragraphs, a conceptualized response has one clear line of argument all the way through. So let's look at an example based on A Christmas Carol. This question and a full answer to it is taken from my second edition guide to English literature, which is linked in the description. And it says, read this extract from chapter 2 of A Christmas Carol, then answer the question that follows. In this extract, the ghost of Christmas past appears to Scrooge. You can pause the video if you want to read the extract. And the question then is, starting with this extract, explore how Dickens uses the supernatural to challenge Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, in the extract and the novel as a whole. Now, the summer 2017 exam report stated, and again this is a paraphrase, there isn't a fixed format for responding to the questions. However, high quality answers often started by addressing the main theme of the question using the entire text, and then dipped in and out of both the extract and the whole text throughout their answer, and this demonstrated a robust and assured understanding of the text and its concepts. Now, I don't know about you, but if something often appears in high mark answers, I want to do that. So let's think about this question in terms of the whole text. However, this does come with a warning. You must write about the extract and the wider text. So even though you're thinking about the whole text, don't forget to include the extract in your answer. So thinking about the whole text, how does Dickens use the supernatural to challenge Scrooge? And when we think about it like that, we can obviously think about the three ghosts, we can think about ignorance and want, we can think about Marley's ghost, and we can see how Dickens uses the supernatural as a narrative device to challenge Scrooge's beliefs and values, to bring about his transformation, and to illustrate the potential for redemption. And it's not just that there's one answer here, there are lots of ideas you could come up with thinking about the supernatural in the text. Here are a few different concepts you might come up with. So you might look at how Dickens employs the supernatural to directly confront Scrooge with the consequences of his actions and attitudes, challenging not only Scrooge but also the reader about their societal obligations. Or you could focus on how Dickens employs the supernatural to challenge Scrooge's self-imposed isolation, revealing the value of community and social responsibility in a time when individualism was often celebrated at the expense of collective well-being. Or you might look at the supernatural figures challenging the root of Scrooge's greed, highlighting the difference between being rich and being fulfilled, and guiding him towards the realization that true happiness comes from acts of generosity. Or you might look at how Scrooge is challenged by the supernatural with the inevitable reality of his own mortality and the negative legacy he will leave behind, and how that prompts a profound self-reflection that stirs his transformation. Or here's a nice idea, the supernatural element disrupts linear time, challenging Scrooge to understand the interconnectedness of past, present and future, thereby emphasising the lasting consequences of his actions and the importance of moral redemption. So all of these would be concepts, lines of argument, hypotheses that could be explored in a well-structured argument throughout the answer. And I just wanted to make this point clear because after the last video I wanted to make it extra clear that it's not as if AQA are saying there's one idea and we want you to guess the idea in our heads. No, what they're saying is explore, think about, come up with your own idea. And I wanted to show you here how with one question there are lots of different ways you could take your answer. Now AO2 is an interesting one. Assessment objectives are set by Ofqual and are the same across all GCSE English Literature specifications. The actual assessment objective is to analyse language form and structure. And up until the 2022 exams, the AQA mark scheme did explicitly list analysis of language and form and structure in the top band. But now there's been a helpful tweak to the mark schemes which refer more broadly to analysis of methods. Now what's happened here? Well, a couple of things. Firstly, it comes back to the point I've already made, that your primary objective in these exams is answering the question. AQA don't want anyone feeling they have to include, let's say, a paragraph on structure or a paragraph on form. It's fine to do that, but, and here's the big important point, only if it actually adds something useful to your analysis in answering the question. And that won't always be the case. The broadening of the mark scheme is there to help students understand that there's no requirement to write about any one specific method. It's all about bringing in relevant methods to your answer. Of course, the assessment objective remains AO2, language, structure and form, so it's never wrong to study these areas, but when we're in the exam we think first and foremost about answering the question and we bring in anything relevant to our answer. It's also important not to have a narrow view of what is meant by AO2. If it's a method the writer's used and it's relevant to your answer, then you can write about it. If there was ever something you weren't sure fit neatly into this assessment objective, like perhaps setting or characterization, you needn't worry. If it's relevant to the question, you can write about it. So let's look at some of the things to do with AO2, but remember this is not an exhaustive list. If there's a method used by the writer that's relevant to your answer, you can include it in your response. Language then is all about a writer's use of words, phrases and language features for effect. Now this includes figurative language such as similes, metaphors, personification, onomatopoeia, that kind of thing, but it's wider than that too. And one way I like to look at language analysis is to ask, where has the writer used a word or phrase where another one would have been fine, but they seem to have chosen that one for a specific effect? So if we take A Christmas Carol, an example would be Dickens's use of the simile solitary as an oyster, or the pathetic fallacy with cold, bleak, biting weather. Those are a couple of examples. Structure is about how the text is organised, the order things take place in. Structure analysis is less about what's happening in a text and more about where it's happening and why. In paper 1, it's really useful to ask yourself, where does the extract come from in the wider text, and how is that relevant to the question I'm being asked? Now, there are different ways of approaching this. You might want to learn some theories on whole text structure, but you don't need to. At the very least, you can ask yourself what happens before and after the extract, and how is that important? For example, imagine you're given this extract from A Christmas Carol and asked about the presentation of ignorance and want. Well, one thing to consider is what happens before and after this extract. And just before this terrifying moment in the novella, we read about the happy party at Fred's house. So we might bring into our answer something about the structural juxtaposition of two very different events, one joyful and one frightening, in order to heighten the impact of this shocking moment with ignorance and want. Now for whole text structure, I like to teach Freytag's pyramid. It runs from left to right, starting with the exposition, where we're introduced to the main character and setting. Then there's the inciting incident, the trigger or catalyst, which builds up to the climax, the moment of greatest tension in the text. And we can apply this, for example, to all of the 19th century novels from this section of the exam. Here it is mapped out to A Christmas Carol. Now, in our question, the extract is part of the rising action, where we expect to see character development and increased tension, and we do see that. In this line, Scrooge reverently disclaimed all intention to offend or any knowledge of having wilfully bonneted the spirit at any period of his life. This is the first time in the novella that Scrooge shows humility, and this is the beginning of his transformation. It shows the start of his redemption, and therefore the character development we expect in the rising action of any text. Now, as I said, you don't have to learn structural theories like Freytag. You might just want to think about what happens before and what happens after the extract. So in our extract, there's a lot of positive imagery related to this ghost, which is a contrast to what's just happened with all of the negative imagery related to Marley's ghost. And perhaps that is important because it shows us that the message this ghost brings will be a positive one that Scrooge and even us, the reader, can learn an important lesson from. Now, form means the type of text you're studying. So in section B, this is a novel or a novella, and a novel is a long piece of creative writing that tells a story, a fictional prose narrative, and it can be 50,000 words long or more. Because of its length, there's scope for complex characterization, plots and subplots. A novella is a fictional prose narrative which is shorter than a novel, but longer than a short story, containing roughly 20,000 to 50,000 words, and because of its length, it's less likely to have subplots and multiple narrators. However, descriptions of character and settings are more detailed than in a short story. Of all the text types that you study in English literature, novel and novella seem to me to be the hardest to write anything relevant about form on in an exam answer. I'm not convinced it's ever been relevant to a past question. You could possibly look at the sense of urgency created through the rapid progression from one ghost to another and the mounting intensity and pressure on Scrooge to change, but personally I wouldn't write about form in this specific question we're looking at, and as I said earlier, that's fine. You don't have to write about it and shouldn't write about it if it's not relevant to your answer. AO3 is context. The term can be understood in a variety of ways and will vary depending on which text you're studying. Context can mean when the text was written, when and where the text is set, the literary context and genre, or responses from different readers. Now, note how genre is classed as context. So if you write about how A Christmas Carol is an allegory, you're hitting AO3, or how Jekyll and Hyde is this complex mix of gothic fiction and scientific journal, that's AO3 in terms of genre. Frankenstein is gothic fiction, that's AO3. But context also links to the wider themes in a text, and a helpful piece of advice from the exam board is that the question will always be worded in such a way that there's a link to context in that question. So once again, answering the question is key. If you answer the question fully, you'll be addressing context. Now, what I'd like to suggest is if you're studying A Christmas Carol, why don't you have a go at answering this question? Take one of these concepts or come up with one of your own, write a full answer on it. There is a full answer on this extract in my guide to English literature, the second edition, which is out now, linked in the description. It's available in paperback on Amazon and ebook instant download at mrbruff.com. But if you found this video useful, please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, and thank you for watching.